A couple of things I'll mention here that I think are noteworthy. First of all, there is a zero data retention
Mm,
policy that is being more and more promoted by major providers of AI. And that is something that for most businesses, if you're doing some kind of business function and you've got a paid account with those services, they do have that as an option, but you have to opt into it. So you have to actually, check that box on the contract. And so that is something I know that Google Gemini offers. Obviously, they offer it with their Vertex AI. Anthropic, Claude offers it. OpenAI with ChatGPT offers it. I think that for that is something. It seems like a checkbox most businesses are going to want to explore, at least, even if there are cost implications. And then on the other side of things, what people are doing in terms of just making sure that these calls to outside companies potentially are private. If you're on Google, if you're on Amazon Web Services, if your solutions are on one of those clouds, Amazon Web Services, just to call them out specifically, they do have a lot of these models running on their own infrastructure in such a way that you can call on those models without ever actually leaving your own environment and virtual private cloud. So if you wind up deploying on some of those public clouds and you want to use AI that is already enabled there, you can do things in such a way that it is still PCI DSS compliant. If you're in healthcare, HIPAA compliant, but more for what we're talking about, would meet the sophisticated compliance requirements of a lot of those types of solutions. So you can do that because it's more and more enabled by public clouds that are actually hosting some of these AI models that allow you to call, within that own infrastructure without hopping out to another third party.
yeah, and in your paper, you touched on how there are a percentage of companies and organizations that are implementing AI into their financial flow. Can you talk about like who they are and what they've been able to accomplish with that?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, one of them that I mentioned is Morgan Stanley. Now, they did a case study with OpenAI, so it's worth just kind of pointing out that this was something that OpenAI wrote to promote the efficacy of their services
Mm,
and their model. But what they did with Morgan Stanley that I think is one of the few times we get some visibility into these things, even if it is of a promotional nature. Morgan Stanley was able to put together, three different applications within their own firm that were broadly adopted up to 98%. And one of the things that they claimed was that they had some verification strategies that specifically involved the way that they challenged the system to make sure it was giving back correct answers
mm,
that helped them achieve that high adoption because people trusted the system. So, you can get into details with it. We actually, are pretty meticulous in terms of our references and citations in the paper. So you can get back to that specific case study if you want to go read the underlying paper. But that is one where you see adoption was very high and met the potential that was mentioned in that Anthropic research that I mentioned earlier, which I think is it was a pretty diligent piece of research. I think that uh, the the metric they came up with of observed exposure that has all of those different components to it, maybe a little too complicated for some people to really want to digest. But the way you can think about what they did is they really took a look at what AI could do for a job. And so you take something like computer programming and math, right?
mhm,
And you look at that and you go, okay, at this point, we see AI, and this is their estimate, but they look at the tasks that someone who works in computer programming and math and say, for this stuff, AI should be able to do about 94% of that job at this point. So there's incredible exposure. But when you actually take a look at all of the things that are running on Claude today, only 33% of those tasks are ever being seen on Claude. So what's the deal? Why is there such a big discrepancy there? And if we take that same logic and turn it to finance, you have a very similar level of automation that they estimate
yeah.
94%, but you're only seeing something like 20% of those tasks actually done in finance. And so kind of going back to the, what companies are really doing, you see very few cases like that Morgan Stanley case. And that's why I think it's worth study, even if it's of a promotional nature, because they really want to try to understand what companies who have really broadly adopted this stuff, what did they do to really get there? Because we're seeing so few examples of that right now, especially in large enterprises, because of the complexity of deploying an enterprise, the regulatory framework of finance, as well as a lot of people in these organizations who are finding it. And this is where it gets really challenging if you're trying to run one of these companies. A lot of the people in these organizations are finding it easier to just go into an unauthorized environment and start using AI in this kind of shadowy way, right? That's not governed by the organization, where the organization loses control over what information it's sharing. You're taking potentially data out of that company and then using AI to make yourself faster at your job. It's understandable why people do that, but it's a management nightmare. It's a regulatory nightmare.
Yeah.
And so finding people who can deploy these successfully within businesses so that they're helpful, but at the same time, get the people within the businesses to use that solution. That's still a very rare case study, and that's why I point to it in the paper.